Welcome, everyone. We're so glad to have you here at the 2025 Kaspar Naegele Memorial Lecture, for which we're really glad and fortunate to welcome Dr. Matt Patterson, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Calgary. This is our second Distinguished Speaker Series of the new year. And Dr. Patterson, we're so glad to welcome you here to UBC. We've been very much looking forward to your visit and are just sorry that so many of us can't make it today in person. But thank you again for making the trek and for joining us. Special thank you also to Christine, Sarah, and Kate, who've been doing a lot of behind the scenes work to navigate logistics through the snow as we shifted online. Thank you all. A final note as we move forward before I turn this over to Catherine and Weiqi, is that when we shift into the question and answer, I'll ask folks on Zoom to please either use the raise hand function or you can type your question in the chat. And then Netta and I will invite you one by one to ask your questions. I believe that most of us are joining over Zoom, but for anyone who might be in person on campus, Catherine will be taking any in-person questions. So we'll sort of toggle between Zoom and in-person. With that, I will hand this over to Catherine. And again, a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Patterson.
Thank you very much, Katie. There's actually 6 of us in the room. I'm not going to turn it around because we're not as technologically savvy, so we are not to move anything. But I wanted to just start by saying the Kaspar Naegele Memorial Lecture celebrates Kaspar Naegele's profound impact on the lives and careers of his students and colleagues during his time at the University of British Columbia. We are very lucky to have his son, Tim Naegele, here, who's in the room. So just envision, he is sitting here. So thank you so much for coming in the snow, an extra challenge. So we really appreciate it. Naegele came to Canada in his teens as a refugee from Nazi Germany. After attaining his PhD at Harvard under Talcott Parsons, he taught at the University of New Brunswick and the University of Oslo. Naegele was a co-editor with Parsons and others of Theories of Society, a collection of classical readings in sociological theory. In 1961, he also co-edited with John Porter and others the first Canadian collection of sociological articles called Canadian Society. The accumulated royalties from the book were endowed, and the earnings continue to fund the Kaspar Naegele lecture that we're having today. Naegele was hired as the second full-time sociologist at UBC in 1954. 10 years later, he became the Dean of Arts at UBC. As dean, Professor Naegele was a champion of educational reform within universities. He is most fondly remembered for his teaching and the compassion he showed to his students. This is the reason that there is also a Kaspar Naegele Memorial Prize in Sociology awarded to undergraduate students every year and supported by the generous donations from his former students. We welcome you all today to celebrate Kaspar Naegele's outstanding career and continue his legacy through these lectures and awards. So welcome, Tim. We're so pleased to have you. I also just want to give an additional shout out to Christine, who was so on top of the snow. She texted me at 10 o'clock last night while I was just watching my Netflix show because she was so on top of it. So thank you very much. I think this has gone pretty seamless given the situation. So in this wonderful tradition, we are very pleased to have Dr. Matt Patterson here from the University of Calgary to talk with us and to formally introduce us, as is our tradition. We're going to have our graduate student representative come up and do that. So thank you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Weiqi. I'm a first-year master's student in the department. And it's wonderful to see you all here and on Zoom or whatever on Zoom or in person. So today I have the immense pleasure of introducing our distinguished speaker for the Kaspar Naegele Memorial Lecture, Dr. Matt Patterson. Dr. Patterson is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Calgary, and he was actually my supervisor when I was doing my undergrad studies at the University of Calgary, and he provided life-changing guidance for my academic career. As an urban sociologist trained at the University of Toronto, he examines the relationship between cities and culture. And Dr. Patterson has published a number of articles and book chapters, including the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, Canadian Journal of Sociology, Canadian Review of Sociology, Urban Studies and Urban Affairs Review and Contemporary Sociology. Dr. Patterson's research spans a variety of critical topics, including cultural planning, iconic architecture, and museums. His 2020 article, Architecture as Performance Arts, Evaluating Iconic Power in the Development of Two Museums, published in the American Journal of Cultural Sociology, offers a groundbreaking evaluation of the symbolic power of architectural developments. His work frequently bridges the gap between cultural theory and urban studies, offering innovative perspectives on how spaces and structures influence collective identity. And in recent years, Dr. Patterson has contributed significantly to the study of North American Chinatowns, focusing on their cultural and historical resilience amid urban development and challenges. His research report, Identity and Culture in Calgary, Chinatown, which was published in 2020, highlights the unique dynamics of Calgary Chinatown and its cultural significance. His research on North American Chinatowns has received multiple grants from SSHRC and the City of Calgary and the University of Calgary. So beyond his research, Dr. Patterson holds several prominent positions. He is the current vice president of the RCO3 Community Research within the International Sociological Association. He's also an active member of the Canadian Sociological Association, the American Sociological Association, and the International Sociological Association. Meanwhile, he's actively engaged in the community service, serving on advisory boards such as the Chinese Canadian History Project and the City of Calgary's Anti-Racist Action Committee. So though echo easy go on, I think it's about the time we give Dr. Patterson the mic to speak on today's lecture titled Living with Ghosts, How Physical Traces of the Past Shape Memories of Trauma in Chinatowns. And with that, please help me in giving a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Matt Patterson.
Thank you so much for that, Wei-Chi. It's really special to be introduced by a student who's I've worked with for a few years and has contributed to this project and including this paper. I'll point out anytime I quote an interview that Wei-Chi did for the project. Let me just figure out how to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the slides now? Yeah, okay, great. Okay. I'm gonna time myself so I don't go over. All right, well, thanks for having me here. And thanks to those who braved the snow to make it in today. I'll refrain from snarky Calgarian comments about snow days, which is a concept we're not familiar with in Alberta and Southern Ontario, where I'm originally from. But it's really an honor to be here. When Netta first invited me, I immediately knew the paper I wanted to present, in part because Vancouver is such a hotbed of Chinatown activism, but also because this paper cites about half a dozen UBC scholars. And so I promise to shamelessly name drop as many of you as I possibly can. But this is also the first time I've had a chance to present the paper publicly. So I'm really eager for feedback, positive or negative, but try to go easy on me if I'm misrepresenting any of your work. But I wanted to actually begin the presentation with the words of another Vancouver-based writer, not faculty at UBC, not that I know of, but this is a poem from the late, great Jim Wong Chu, the poet laureate of Vancouver's Chinatown. I don't know if you can see it there. This is from his collection called Chinatown Ghosts. And the poem is entitled Old Chinese Cemetery, Kamloops, July 1977. And it goes like this. Like a child lost, wandering about. Oh, I have a slide for this. All right. Oh, I got that. There we go. Like a child lost, wandering about, touching, feeling tattered grounds, touching, seeing wooden boards, etched in ink, etched in weather, etched in fading memories, etched, faded, forgotten. I walk on earth above the bones of a multitude of gold mountain men, searching for scraps of memory. Like a child unloved, his face pressed hard against the wet window, peering in, for a desperate moment, I touch my past. Wang Chu's poems interrogate issues of belonging and identity for Chinese Canadians in light of this country's long and well-documented history of Chinese exclusion, exploitation, and discrimination. As such, his writings exemplify what sociologists call cultural trauma. According to Jeffrey Alexander, cultural trauma occurs when members of a collectivity feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever, and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. Despite the initial harms themselves, as collective memory, cultural traumas can become a source of social solidarity. It can turn individual suffering into a shared responsibility. It allows contemporary generations to identify on a deeply emotional level with those who came before. Although it's rooted in the past, it allows communities to understand hardships they may be facing in the present and envision possible futures that they can work towards together. The paper I'm going to share with you today examines the role of cultural trauma in motivating and guiding Save Chinatown campaigns that have emerged in cities across Canada and the United States. As I'll discuss, the groups fighting for the preservation of these neighborhoods today are quite different from the generations that founded these neighborhoods in the late 19th and early 20th century, in part because many of their connections to these neighborhoods are largely voluntary. Many of them don't live here, they don't own property or businesses here. Nonetheless, they've devoted a lot of their time to fighting for the preservation of these neighborhoods. Understanding the motivations and their self-conception sheds light on what Dolores Hayden called the power of place, the way that history and collective identity can be bound up in a physical location in a way that motivates high levels of civic engagement and collective obligation. So I both plan to demonstrate the role of cultural trauma in this process and also explain why trauma narratives in particular are salient to these communities. So those are my empirical aims. The paper also has a theoretical aim, which is in resolving tension in the way that sociologists have conceptualized trauma. So for the moment, I want to put Chinatowns aside and focus specifically on cultural trauma. That term comes to sociology through psychiatry. It's probably best known to people as it relates to post-traumatic stress disorder, where a harmful event in one's past leads to unpleasant recurrent memories afterwards. In true Durkheimian fashion, sociologists have accused psychiatry of being too focused on the individual, both in terms of experiences and in terms of symptoms, and have reconceptualized trauma as a group level phenomenon that relates to social structure and or culture. But from their perspectives in sociology have tended to bifurcate into two different approaches that we can call realist and constructivist. So realists are focused on events themselves and their direct harms on people and community. Classic example in the realist perspective is Kai Erickson's book, Everything in Its Path, which looked at the effects of the Buffalo Creek flood in West Virginia. And Erickson distinguished individual trauma faced by those who were physically threatened by the flood and lost property in the flood from collective trauma, which he said was caused by the breakdown in community and social support. And collective trauma was far more widespread in its effects and longer lasting. Outside of academia, this realist perspective on trauma is implicit in the social institutions we've established to deal with past harms and atrocities. truth and reconciliation commissions, state apologies. These offer authoritative accounts of what really happened, who was really harmed, who was the perpetrators, and what was the nature of the harm. Constructivism has been developed somewhat in opposition of realism. It's most associated with the strong program in cultural sociology and Jeffrey Alexander's work, who I quoted earlier. Alexander accuses realists of what he calls naturalistic fallacy, which refers to the view that historic events have unambiguous and fixed meanings that are unproblematically represented in collective memory. So rather than focusing on historic events themselves, constructivists tend to focus on the way subsequent generations engage in a creative process of collective memorization through which past events are represented and popularized as traumas, and that become kind of core to a group's identity. A good example of this is Ron Eierman's study on African-American identity, which he says was shaped by Black intellectuals in the late 19th century who did not experience slavery directly, but who saw it as a foundational trauma in creating their community. Now, constructivists have attracted their own criticism. Hans Joas argues that Alexander and others depreciate that term trauma by focusing only on representations, thereby sidestepping those questions of what really happened and who was really affected. I do think in their effort to distinguish themselves from realism, constructivists have arguably left the connection between historic events themselves and the conditions under which those events become incorporated into collective memory under-examined. But I do think there's nothing about constructivism itself that closes off the possibility of bridging that divide. And here's the first name drop of the presentation. Your colleague Seth Aberton has written a paper that does this, that uses evolutionary theory to kind of bridge historic events and the process of collective memorization, looking at a particular event, the displacement of the Israelites, creating conditions that selected for identity narratives that had an emphasis on purity. I think generally, if we want to justify the term trauma in Joas's eyes, well, avoiding the naturalistic fallacy for someone like Alexander, I think we have to show two things. First, we have to show that historic events have significantly altered the conditions under which a community understands itself and its past. And the second is that contemporary generations should be shown to experience strong negative emotions associated with the past events that not only connect the past, but also influence how they understand present hardships that they're facing, and also generate fears of future harm or victimization. So in reconciling these perspectives, I take inspiration from that quote, that quoted poem from Jim Wong Chu, which reminds us that historic harms don't just live on in people's minds, in their living memory, or even in words on a page, that they leave physical traces in the landscape. Sometimes they're visible, sometimes they're invisible, but those traces can haunt the living like ghosts. And so I adopt a materialist approach that focuses on how these physical traces mediate the relationship between past events and contemporary memorization. While physical traces don't determine how or even if an event is going to be incorporated into collective memory as trauma, they can nonetheless become powerful independent factors within the memorization process. And so in the cases of Chinatowns, which I'm going to get to shortly, I identified two avenues through which physical traces of the past shape the construction and adoption of trauma narratives. The first is as becoming iconic representations of trauma. So harmful events can leave these highly visible marks in the physical landscape that become powerful representations of those events for subsequent generations. And I identified three types of icons in this presentation that I'll describe later on, what I call stubborn icons, emergent icons, and created icons. The second one, and I don't think I'm going to have time to get to it, unfortunately, in this presentation, but I'll give you a little bit of a description of it now, is when physical traces of the past create ongoing hardship. So events of the past can do things to the physical environment to plunge communities into situations of hardship and precarity that cause them problems on a daily basis, right? And so I should actually explain the images I have up here on the slide. So in terms of icons of trauma, I mean, one of the most famous icons of trauma is this dark mark on the steps of a bank in Hiroshima, thought to be the shadow of a victim of the atomic bomb, right? A highly visible symbol of this harmful event. Next to it, I have the Vine Street Expressway that runs through Philadelphia's Chinatown. So the expressway is what I would call a stubborn icon. You know, it very much represents this painful moment in Philadelphia Chinatown's history when large parts of the neighborhood were bulldozed to make way for this expressway. It's hard to miss, it's visually striking, but more than just symbolizing the harm, this expressway pumps out noise pollution, air pollution, it causes mobility challenges, it causes gridlock, it causes public safety threats, especially for pedestrians. And so on a daily basis, ever since this thing was built, the residents of Philadelphia's Chinatown have had to confront these problems in their daily life. And one thing cultural sociologists know pretty well is that narratives resonate with people when they connect to problems that they face regularly in their everyday life. And this connection is not just on a logical level, that is like, I'm wondering why I'm facing this problem and this narrative is explaining why, but also on an emotional level as well, right? So when I'm plunged into some kind of affective state, vulnerability, fear, frustration, or even, you know, joy or excitement, something like that, and a narrative comes along that helps me explain the things I'm feeling, then that also creates resonance. All right, so those are the two ways that I identified through which physical traces of the past shape the collective memorization process. So now on to Chinatowns. In the paper, I have a whole section that situates my research within this very long history of Chinatown research and sociology. Unfortunately, I don't have time to really get into it in this presentation. It also doubles as a historic background on Chinatowns, where I can introduce some terms that probably most of you know, but others might be unfamiliar with. So I'll mention head tax, exclusion act, urban renewal, things like that. I'm hoping most people are vaguely aware about what I'm talking about, but you know, feel free to ask me more about it in the Q&A. But I did want to just briefly say something about the history of studying Chinatowns in sociology. First of all, from the point of view of cultural trauma, Chinatowns are a really good case for understanding how cultural connections are forged across generations, particularly as they relate to harm and trauma. It's also, you know, a topic that sociologists, as I say, have been studying for over a century. And the one thing I did want to share with you is this bar graph that shows the number of articles that mention Chinatown in the AJS, ASR, and social forces. So these are not all these aren't all studies of Chinatown. A lot of them are studies of Chinatown, but they show us when sociologists were talking about Chinatown, like when people felt the need to bring up Chinatown in their articles, again, these kind of top tier American journals. And you can see very clearly these two waves when Chinatowns were really of interest to sociologists. The first wave peaking in the 1940s, that corresponds to the influence of the Chicago School. Rose Hum Lee from the Chicago School is the most represented author there. Also people like Paul Siu. Your colleague over in history, Henry Yu, wrote this amazing book called Thinking Orientals, came out in 2001, that documents this whole history. And I'll just direct you to that book rather than say more about this. But you see the drop off in the 1950s, which also kind of corresponds to when human ecology and the Chicago schools falling out of favor. And then this huge spike in research peaking in the 1990s. This corresponds to what the late David Ley at the University of Victoria called the revival period of Chinatowns. Again, can't really go into what was causing that revival, but happy to chat about it in the Q&A. But sociologists were really interested in this. And so the articles you find here, a lot of them out of the enclave economy perspective. Alejandro Portes, Min Zhao in particular are represented here. And then you have this like pretty dramatic drop off in the 2010s and further into the 2020s, although we're not done the decade yet. And I understand this as really a change in the role of Chinatown within processes of migration. So in these two waves, you have a lot of differences between human ecology and things like enclave economy. But what is common is that both of these perspectives largely understood Chinatowns as operating within processes of migration and settlement and integration or assimilation, depending on which perspective you're looking at. They are, I'm going to borrow language from Amin Ghaziani's book, they adopted an enclave epistemology to understand Chinatowns. And the fact is that in most large cities, including this one in Vancouver, and certainly in Calgary and Toronto, where I'm from originally, Chinatowns just do not play the same central role within migration from East Asia and China that they once did. So I should also say, like lots of books came out in the 80s and 90s, including another UBC reference, Kay Anderson, Vancouver's Chinatown in 1990. Today the Chinese, American, and Canadian population is larger, it's more diverse, it's more dispersed than ever. And historic Chinatowns are really, again, going back to the language of There Goes the Neighborhood by Amin, the Chinatowns are like a niche island within this larger cultural archipelago. And the neighborhoods themselves, as you can see from these graphs, are also becoming less Chinese, right? So migration scholars not as interested in Chinatowns. That doesn't mean nobody's studying Chinatowns. Today, you'll find Chinatown research most commonly within gentrification research. So my project does not engage with gentrification directly, but it asks questions that I think are common to the previous waves of Chinatown research, which is what draws people to Chinatown? How do we understand the resonance these neighborhoods have for the communities that sustain them? But what's different is, whereas in the past we might address these questions from the perspective of migration and settlement, today we have to come up with other answers to them. And that's what brings me to cultural sociology. Now finally onto my research project. And sometimes I'll be saying I, and sometimes I'll be saying we. That's because I work with a team. And so I'll introduce my co-investigator on this, Henry Tsang, who's a practicing architect based in Calgary, and also an associate professor in architecture at Athabasca University. I also we work with over a dozen RAs on this project over the years, but I really want to highlight Weiqi Li, who has been on the project for years, as you all know him at UBC now, and Brian Cook, who's a PhD in sociology at the University of Calgary. So they've contributed a lot to this project, including doing interviews. I'll leave it there and go into the methodology. So the project began in support of a Chinatown cultural planning process that was undertaken by the city of Calgary. Chinatown in Calgary is under development pressures like Vancouver's Chinatown. And so the city of Calgary was developing this cultural plan. It came out in 2022 to try to insulate the neighborhood and protect its identity and culture from development. And so we were asked to get involved, and we started by interviewing what we're calling placemakers in Chinatown, people who are involved in kind of shaping the urban and social form of the neighborhood. So this was community activists, leaders of community associations, urban planners, architects, and local artists. We're asking people why, or about their personal connections to the neighborhood, about their work as placemakers, their visions for the neighborhood, their fears about the neighborhood. Interviews were conducted in English, Cantonese, and Mandarin, depending on the preference of the participant. We do a lot of community engaged work, which also gives us a chance to kind of do participant observation. So a lot of times we are attending public meetings and presenting our research and getting feedback. A lot of the questions we ask just come from people in the community who are giving us ideas. Henry in particular does a lot of urban design work in Chinatown, including designing an expansion for the local senior center. We do archival and statistical analysis to kind of look at trends affecting the neighborhood in the past 20 years. And then subsequently, we expanded this to 15 other cities in Canada and the US, doing similar kinds of analysis. We did 24 more interviews, so about 68 interviews total. The interviews we did were in Philadelphia, Toronto, San Francisco, Chicago, and Edmonton. Additional statistical and archival research. And then a big part of our data are these 34 Chinatown neighborhood plans that have been produced in these 16 cities between 2010 and 2024. So I should note, I'm happy to also talk about positionality and my relationship with the community and doing this kind of research as a white guy. I couldn't fit it in the presentation, but if anyone wants to ask about those parts, I'm happy to chat about it in the Q&A. But as we're analyzing our data, what are we looking for? We were looking for what Mario Small calls dominant neighborhood narrative frames, which he defines as concrete sets of categories through which neighborhoods, houses, streets, parks, et cetera, are made sense of and understood. And in Mario Small's book, Villa Victoria, he uses neighborhood narrative frames to explain differences in levels of civic engagement and social capital. So showing how narrative frames can actually motivate people to get involved with their neighborhood, which was certainly of interest to us. So let's get into the data. So I'll say that cultural trauma is not something I studied prior to this project. I come out of studying culture-led urban revitalization. I studied museums and arts districts and architecture and stuff like that. And so I thought I was getting into a project that I was going to give me a window into a neighborhood's attempt to use cultural planning to bring in more customers, more tourists, to regenerate the local economy. And very quickly, it became clear that the people we were speaking to didn't really want to talk about economic revitalization that much. They wanted to talk about the importance of these historic harmful events on Chinatown and the continuity between those events and the work they were engaged in, in the 2020s. So when we ask people about the importance of Chinatown, they give us answers like this. This comes from a woman in her 60s. She, a longtime Chinatown activist, came to Canada in the 70s from Hong Kong. She says this: Chinatowns remind us of our social past. Some people actually think that we chose to have a Chinatown, but it was not an option. It was not a cultural destination to begin with because of blatant discrimination. Part of the learning is that this is already the third Chinatown. Why is there a third Chinatown? It's because the community was forced to relocate twice. And if we're not diligent enough to recognize it and to protect this culturally significant place, then it will be forced to move again. I think that's the significant role that Chinatown plays. So here she's giving us a charter narrative, a story of the origins of Chinatown that identify these two moments of displacement in the late 19th and early 20th century, when the community was pushed out of other areas of Calgary and eventually had to settle in this flood-prone area down by the river. And it's a narrative we heard from a lot of participants. It's very well known in the neighborhood. It's enshrined in an exhibition in the Chinese Cultural Center. It's in the opening pages of the new cultural plan. And what the quote demonstrates is how narratives of past displacement lead to fear of future displacement, right? It's happened twice before. It can happen again, which is why she's fighting for this neighborhood to prevent it, right? Not just in interviews, we read similar kinds of accounts in the Chinatown plans and the written material. For us, the Chinatown plans are useful because they also provide a kind of authoritative account, right? Some of them are written by municipal governments, some of them are written by community organizations, but they generally represent a kind of the end of a consultation process where the The authors are coming up with a authoritative account of what is this neighborhood about, what are the problems it faces, what is its vision for the future. So it carries meaning when in the very introduction of Philadelphia's plan, for instance, and this is by the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, the PCDC. I'll be referencing them a few times in this presentation. They write this: the legacy of Chinatown's founding history, rooted in racial discrimination and injustice, still reverberates through the neighborhood's built environment and social and economic relations. It is in many ways unchanged. In order to protect what we love about Chinatown, we must plan for the future with consideration of this legacy. So again, you see the way the past is tied into the future and into the present. And moreover, this is kind of corroborates Alexander's idea that cultural trauma is used to generate this sense of collective obligation or shared responsibility. And also Mario Small's findings about narratives leading to civic engagement. Also, before I go on, note that our findings are not like totally new. I just want to give a couple shout outs to people who have done this research already. So Jan Lin, who's a big Chinatown scholar in LA, wrote a book in 2010 called The Power of Urban Ethnic Places. So also kind of referencing that Dolores Hayden concept. And he has a couple chapters on different Chinatowns and mentions collective trauma being core to Chinatown preservation efforts. And then more recently in Toronto, a woman named Pearl Zhang, who got her master's at York University, did this excellent thesis. It's been a paper that's come out of it on studentification of Chinatown. But the thesis identifies what she calls head tax stories, which are stories that people tell about their relatives who paid the head tax. So this would have been pre-1923. And she says the head tax stories are used to claim authority to speak for the neighborhood, right? So if someone can trace their family to this harmful event in the past, it's seen as lending them an authority to speak for the Chinatown in the present. Okay, so if we're taking the constructivist view that harmful events in the past do not in themselves guarantee that they're going to be remembered as trauma, then we have to explain why these particular narratives resonate with contemporary generations in Chinatown. And it was in trying to answer that question that we came to think of Chinatown as a cultural reservoir that's accumulated physical traces of the past. And I realized earlier I used Amin Ghaziani's concept of the cultural archipelago, and reservoirs and islands are not just a mixed metaphor, but literally the opposite things. So just excuse that. And we're on to reservoirs now, archipelagos, that was several slides ago. So the cultural reservoir, this is actually a term that one of my RAs, JC Magnuson, started using, and I thought it was like really great and really captured what we were seeing. So reservoirs are not memorials, right? Most research on cultural trauma that look at spaces and physical things focus on purposely built memorials, so articles of Vietnam Memorial, the 9/11 Memorial, Oklahoma City bombing memorial. Cultural reservoirs can have memorials, they have multiple memorials, but those are just one of the many features that make historical events relevant to contemporary generations within cultural reservoirs. So within cultural reservoirs, the sacred intermingles with the profane. Right? Memories of the past are evoked by a wide variety of symbols and experiences that are encountered within the mundane course of everyday life. It's not a single thing, but the overall place character that reinforces connections to the past. And as I mentioned, we conceptualize these traces of the past in two ways, one primarily symbolic as iconic representations, one more experiential as ongoing harm. So I'll focus on the iconic for now and see how quickly I can get through it. Icons, just to remind you, visually striking objects through which people connect to some larger fundamental social meaning. That's the way, this is also from the STRONG program. So Jeffrey Alexander and Dominique Bartmansky have talked a lot about iconic objects. And And we were interested in how our participants, as they were talking about these big historic narratives, they would also kind of drop references to streets, places, parks, buildings into their discussion. And we came to think of these objects, these icons, as creating cognitive and conversational scaffolding. There's another term we're borrowing from cultural sociology, through which narratives are constructed and transmitted from person to person. And so, as I mentioned, we identified 3 different types of icons that relate to different material processes. And the first one I want to talk about, I'm calling stubborn icons. And these are defined by their durability. They are created during episodes of past harm, and that they remain stuck conspicuously in that landscape over generations. Writing in the 1980s, the sociologist Kwok Bun Chan in Montreal described the newly built Guy Favreau building, which you can see there in the middle. He says, gigantic, large-scale, ultra-modern federal and provincial government buildings hover over and encroach upon the low-lying buildings of Chinatown like tombstones, seemingly reminding the Chinese people that their days of urban space are numbered. Right? So through this building, he's not just complaining of how ugly the building is. He's really reaching at something more fundamental, and really the idea of Chinese exclusion generally. And the other thing that's worth pointing out is he could have been writing about any number of Chinatowns across Canada and the United States, many of which were targeted for post-war urban development and urban renewal projects that produce buildings and expressways like this. So in Calgary, the Harry Hayes Federal Building, which you can see on the left side, was built in 1979. Since then, its hulking brown exterior has marked the eastern boundary of the neighborhood. More than 40 years later, it still angers a lot of community members, including those who were not born or old enough to remember its original construction. Dale Lee Kwong, who's a Canadian-born writer, poet, and playwright, who gave my students and I walking tours of the neighborhood when we first started out. She says this about Harry Hayes. She says, "I'm really livid about the Harry Hayes building, even now. People don't know that it's technically part of Chinatown. To me, it's just an eyesore. And this thing they did should be acknowledged. They should have a plaque that says more than 70 intergenerational families were living here together, and we kicked them all out and we relocated them. Imagine what Calgary's Chinatown would be like today if that land had not been appropriated." So we have a lot of other quotes about Harry Hayes. I can't go into them all here, but I will say Harry Hayes, so you can see there the 2 blocks of housing in 72, and then by 79, it's just one big fortress of a building. People would just kind of reference Harry Hayes, especially when they were talking about the threat of development, this idea that was common among a lot of people of Chinatown shrinking, like losing ground to the kind of office space that was being built around it. And so it became a kind of a cautionary tale. And one of the reasons we even started this project was because there was a condo project proposed in the kind of mid-2010s, and people would liken it to the Harry Hayes. So it's the durability that makes Harry Hayes and Guy Favreau and the Vine Street Expressway a connection to the past, but some objects become iconic representations of the past for the opposite reason, because they change. So a lot of research in the sociology of materiality has been interested in this aspect of objects. Not that objects are these stable things that stabilize social life, but they're these dynamic things that can disrupt social life. Indeed, traces of the past can remain hidden for years before suddenly and unexpectedly being unearthed in ways that re-traumatize communities. And I want to come back to that in the conclusion. But for now, I want to talk about a different way in which objects change, and that's by breaking down. So Terence McDonald, who's a cultural sociologist, talks about cultural entropy, meaning that the intended meaning of a cultural object becomes obscured as the object experiences physical breakdown. But when it comes to trauma, you can get the opposite effect, where highly visible signs of entropy can turn formerly overlooked buildings into powerful symbols of loss and harm. And so in the paper, I have go into depth in perceptions of decline in Chinatown. It's really a complicated topic and multidimensional. I can't really quite get into it now, but I do want to focus on this one type of architecture that you're probably familiar with in Chinatown, this vernacular style, which basically involves covering usually an ordinary commercial building with ornamentation, as you see here, inspired by historic imperial Chinese architecture, right? It's like from the 15th century and onward. A lot of people in Chinatown have a very ambivalent relationship with this kind of architecture. Indeed, people inside and outside Chinatown have really at times denounced this architecture as being inauthentic, as being Disneylandish, as being even self-orientalizing, referencing Edward Said's concept there. The recent report out of Toronto, Community Power for Anti-Displacement, this is associated with the group Friends of Chinatown TO, an anti-gentrification activist group. They write in the report strategically that this architecture was strategically designed to appeal to tourists, often in response to being stigmatized by the white middle and upper class consumers. So they understand this architecture as being rooted in racism. But on the other hand, this is the cover of the report. They chose to put on that cover the Bright Pearl restaurant, that yellow building in the top corner there, which was Toronto Chinatown's most highly visible example of this style of architecture. And what's also interesting about that is the Bright Pearl restaurant doesn't exist anymore. That facade is gone. The property owners ripped it down. They redeveloped the building into a modernist office building. And it sparked really a really angry community response. Right? There were protests, there's vandalism against it. The report itself describes the redevelopment as disrespectful to Chinatown. But it also says this, that, where am I here? It says, vague Sino-architectural form does not a Chinatown make. In other words, this architectural style is not actually that important, but its decay or destruction symbolizes an attack on the community itself. All right, so clearly an ambivalent relationship to this architecture. And when we ask our participants, you know, they'd be sad when a building like this falls apart or is at risk of being lost in the community. But if you ask, okay, well, should we, you know, build more buildings like this? We didn't really get too many people who are crazy about the idea of building more buildings like this. So Japonica Brown-Saraceno has a term for this. She calls it critical nostalgia, where shared feelings of loss can become the basis for collective solidarity without a desire to actually recreate that past. And I don't have time to go into it, but another example from Philadelphia, the old Chinese Cultural Center in YMCA, which you see there, this ornate vernacular facade, it's been sitting empty since 2007. And the same community organizations that in the 70s really denounced this building and the groups who controlled it are now fighting to preserve it. All right, last type of iconic object, what I call created icons. I'm going to stay in Philadelphia for this. This is when communities take the physical traces of past harms and transform them into purposely designed objects or places to memorialize those harms as traumas. So one thing about the urban renewal projects, they don't just produce what Chan called tombstones, like Harry Hayes or like the Vine Street Expressway. They also often leave this trail of detritus in their wake. You know, this is like empty lots that have been knocked down and never used for anything. Weird patches of lawn that fit the infrastructure, but just kind of have no purpose. Ruined or isolated buildings, and areas marked by pollution and contamination. And so these spaces, they're not stubborn icons. They're not like the Vine Street Expressway. I mean, the Vine Street Expressway is going to be there for the rest of our lives. It's indifferent to the community's hatred towards it. They're not changing that thing. But redeveloping an empty lot is a lot easier. So it's not stubborn. It's also not subject to entropy because it's already in a broken down state. You know, a empty parking lot gets a few more cracks in the asphalt. No one really pays attention. I describe these spaces more as liminal in Sharon Zukin's sense of that term, meaning they're like no man's lands. That's her term. They're dislocated from community life and from social order. Liminal spaces not only create the opportunity for redevelopment, they seem to demand it. Communities often find liminal spaces intolerable. They're disordered. They don't fit into the community order and community life. So consider the Vine Street Expressway, which I have up here. When this expressway was first proposed, the city had planned to demolish the Holy Redeemer Chinese Catholic Church. The PCDC, who I mentioned earlier, was instrumental in fighting for the preservation of that church, but the church ended up marooned on the other side of the expressway. And we interviewed Friar Thomas Betts, who arrived at the church in 1991. This is just when the final form of the expressway was being finished after a multi-decade construction process. And he said this: our Chinatown was impacted by a big development project, which was the building up of a 13-lane highway between Chinatown and our school and church. When I came to Philadelphia, our neighborhood was, the neighborhood around the Catholic church and school was completely blighted. So I joined with the board of the PCDC to try to work with the community to try to ameliorate some of the effects of this horrible development program. So since then, the PCDC has been really active in taking some of the leftover land that surrounds the expressway and redeveloping it into social housing, public spaces, community amenities, in an effort to try to bring community life on both sides of the expressway back together. And now they're engaged in their most ambitious project ever, which is called the Chinatown Stitch, which proposes to build 2 blocks of deck over the expressway. I mean, one thing they managed to get the city to do is sink the expressway below, and now they want to deck over it and build this park that will be a kind of central meeting area from the 2 sides. And it's gotten a lot of support, and the supporters include the city of Philadelphia, which says that the Chinatown Stitch is a means of healing, and it will do that by sewing the disconnected parts of Chinatown together and addressing the ongoing harm of the expressway. It also got about $150 million from the Federal Department of Transportation. I have no idea what's happening with that now, but I can confirm the website is still online and still has a picture of Pete Buttigieg there. So clearly it's escaped Elon Musk's gaze at the moment. But well, at last, the website for the Department of Transportation calls the expressway a noose. So it's been strangling Chinatown. So this language of harm and healing is built right into the justification for this project. All right, I'm pretty much at 45 minutes, so I'll just rush through the last few things. I do want to point out a kind of parallel example from Calgary. So Calgary's Chinatown was successful in fighting a similar expressway project. All the different family associations got together. They found this organization called the Senlock Society that in the late 60s defeated a proposed expressway. And then one of the areas of cleared land that had been left over in preparation for the expressway, they raised money and turned it into this park, the Senlock Park. And the park not only memorializes the victory over the expressway, it situates that victory within the larger story of Chinese exclusion and overcoming through public art, through plaques, various things. The centerpiece is this sculpture In Search of Gold Mountain by Chu Han Sun that has the years 1885, 1923, and 1947, the passing of the Head Tax Exclusion Act and then the repeal. Okay, and then last thing, as I mentioned, I don't really have time to talk more about the experiential side. So the icons really, there's not a huge divide, right? As I mentioned, the expressway is both an icon and creates problems for people. But we analytically separated the more symbolic role of physical traces and then the more experiential, which, as I mentioned, creates these ongoing problems. I do want to just though share a common sentiment that we came across, which is that a lot of people, not just in Calgary, but in the other Chinatowns that we studied, people feel like the city pushes all of its social problems into Chinatown, right? Whether it's building the expressway there, let them deal with the pollution and the congestion, addiction, homelessness, a lot of these problems they see as being purposely put into Chinatown so other communities don't have to deal with it. In Edmonton, for instance, they have the city of Edmonton has 3 safe injection or safe consumption sites. All 3 are in and around Chinatown, right? Which actually this protest is from Edmonton related to that. And then so we started this research before the pandemic and then really got into it during the pandemic because we saw what was happening. But there was a sentiment not only that the city has pushed all these problems into Chinatown, but since the pandemic, this combination of the breakdown in social order, but also anti-Asian racism has pushed Chinatown into this kind of downward spiral of social disorder. And so some of our participants, in the face of this, did kind of reach for those historical narratives. So here's an example. This is a business owner in Calgary's Chinatown. He says, I could imagine our lived experience right now during COVID would be something like the Exclusion Act and head tax, something like that, right? Not to that extent, not even close, of course, but just think about it from that perspective. And it wasn't just feelings of vulnerability. Others saw Chinatown as a resource that could be marshaled in opposition to anti-Asian discrimination and social disorder. So here's Tony Wong, and this is actually an interview that Wei Chi did with Tony Wong, who's the current president of the Chinese Cultural Center in Calgary. He said this: when Donald Trump was president, he once talked about the Wuhan virus and that the Chinese are the problem of our employment. I just hope that the people who have visited the Chinese Cultural Center will have sympathy for us after hearing our stories. They will know that the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act hurt us very much. So from Tony's perspective, and indeed, as we've seen with the Stop Asian Hate protests, which in cities that have historic Chinatowns, many of these protests took place in Chinatown, either completely or they marched from City Hall to Chinatown. They're taking advantage of the fact that Chinatown does preserve this memory of past trauma, and it's a resource that can potentially be used for extending sympathy, understanding, and solidarity. Okay, and last slide, just to conclude, I want to take us back to Kamloops in 1977, to where Jim Wong Chu is walking among the faded wooden grave markers in the old Chinese cemetery, as he says, searching for scraps of memory. If we travel 3 miles up the South Thompson River, from that cemetery, we arrive at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, located in the Kamloops Tsik-Wapam First Nation, then in its final year of operation. Now we can move forward to the year 2021. This is more than 4 decades after the school's closure, more than 6 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada declared the Indian Residential School a weapon of cultural genocide. At this time and in this place, the Kamloops Tsik-Wapam First Nation announced that ground-penetrating radar have detected evidence of what they believe to be hundreds of unmarked graves on the school grounds. Now, despite the fact that the harms of the Indian Residential School had been thoroughly documented years earlier, the sudden appearance of physical evidence of these harms sets off widespread public grief and protest among both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people across Canada. So cultural trauma necessarily is shaped by the way physical traces of past harms and atrocities may disappear, reappear, transform, or remain stubbornly situated in the landscape. As such, the material landscape serves as an important medium that connects past harms to the contemporary process of collective memorization. The material qualities of cultural reservoirs influence the extent to which communities can become trapped in a cycle of re-traumatization, burdened by ongoing hardship and precarity, and fear of future victimization, or whether they can do what Alexander calls working through trauma by creating new places that reaffirm their identity, repair their social structure, and elicit sympathy and shared responsibility. And with that, I thank you all for joining in person and on Zoom.